Ian has curated several exhibitions of his father's work, including Life Model, Charles White and His Students for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, Monumental Practice, Charles White at David Zwarner Gallery in New York, and Charles White, Leonardo da Vinci, which is a very intriguing subject, at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Next, I would like to welcome Esther Adler, Curator of Drawings and Prints at New York's Museum of Modern Art, and the co-curator of Charles White, A Retrospective, a very important exhibition in 2018 that appeared in the 3 cities in which Charles White lived. It was at the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Ms. Adler is the organizer of the current exhibition at MoMA, New Ground, Jacob Samuel and Contemporary Etching, and the editor of the accompanying catalog. Her past exhibitions include a variety of things. Joseph E. Yoakum, What I Saw, in 2021, a much heralded exhibition of the work of a self-taught artist, and Betty Saar, The Legends of Black Girl's Window, organized with Christophe Chéry in 2019. Please welcome them both here to the Cincinnati Art Museum. Neither has been here before to Cincinnati. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Esther to the podium.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. I want to thank Julie and Haley for inviting me. And I will just get started. So I like to start my talks about Charles White with this slide of the banners in front of the Art Institute of Chicago and on the street lamps around the Museum of Modern Art in New York when we opened Charles White's major retrospective in 2018. Because for me, this makes the point of just how marquee this exhibition was for both of these major institutions. They were huge, it was a huge draw, it brought many crowds, and I think that was an incredible surprise for many people at the museum, but it was really a major moment both in my career as well as this a major moment in the look back at Charles White's career. And White's career, as Julie mentioned, there we go. How do I, oh, there we go. Charles White's career, as Julie mentioned, unfolded on over 3 major cities. So from the beginning, we knew that we wanted the exhibition as well to visit those 3 major cities. So the first one was Chicago, where White was born and raised, and a photo of the young Charles White there at top, taken at that moment in his life. He then moved to New York, where he spent roughly the 40s and the 50s at Center, and then he ends up in Los Angeles, where he makes, I think, the broadest mark of his career. And so the tour of the exhibition also followed this kind of chain of 3 cities. So Charles White actually landed at MoMA for the first time in 1943. This is one of my favorite images from our exhibition, from our archives. It shows White and his wife at the time, the artist Elizabeth Catlett, with our founding director, Alfred Barr, and our famous chief curator, Dorothy Miller, who is wearing the most amazing hat, and Alexander Calder brooch. And so White was already visiting with major museum directors and curators at this moment in the 40s. His work first entered our collection in 1970 when we acquired all of the prints that he made with Tamarind Lithography Workshop in Los Angeles. But I'll say this was almost by accident. Our interest was not so much in Charles White as it was in the print workshop itself. So we had these incredible works and we acquired several more in the years to come, but I will fully admit that even as a modern art curator who considered herself relatively well-versed in art by Black Americans in the 20th century, I had not heard of Charles White before 2011. And what happens in 2011? Professor and art historian Kelly Jones organizes what I really think is one of the most influential exhibitions of the past 30 years, which is called Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980. And the installation image I'm showing you here is from that exhibition's presentation at PS1, which is MoMA's partner partner institution. I really can't emphasize enough how incredibly influential this show was. And a major part of the show was Charles White's inclusion. And Professor Jones really argues for White's critical role in the art world in California, both through his artwork, through his role as a teacher, and I think most importantly for his role as a professional Black artist at a time when that was not something people were necessarily aware of as an option. She also included what are some of White's best works, and you can see two of them there to the right, a work called Birmingham Totem that's been in the High Museum of Art's collection since the 60s, and a work on the right that is called Black Pope. MoMA bought a lot of work out of this exhibition. That's how influential it was. And for me, certainly the most major acquisition was, in fact, the Black Pope. And here it is very centrally located in kind of the final moment of our retrospective exhibition. This work made really had an exceptional effect on me. It's a work that I've looked at for I don't know how many hours over the course of the past 7 years. I have spent a lot of time not only looking at it, but talking about it with other curators, with conservators, with other artists, with White students, with his family. And I wrote a small book on this work prior to organizing the retrospective exhibition. And frankly, it is still a work that when I look at anew, I have a lot of questions about. I still enjoy thinking about it. I still enjoy talking about it. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that I was excited to come and be part of this discussion tonight, the chance to re-engage with this. So being a museum curator is a unique job because not only are we historians, not only do we have to do the research and the writing about history, but we have to find and study the actual objects that make art history, and we have to find ways to bring them into dialogue with each other in ways that convince our visitors that they are as amazing as we know they are. And so I think the most pleasurable part of organizing a Charles Wright retrospective was that opportunity to find these objects, many of which had not been seen publicly in decades, and to organize them in ways that really convinced our audiences just how exceptional an artist he was. And so at MoMA, that began with White's first mural project. White made murals for the Works Progress Administration, which was sponsored by the US government during the Great Depression. His first mural was called Five Great American Negroes. It features Sojourner Truth, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, Mahalia Jackson, and George Washington Carver. And you can see at bottom a publicity still that was shot by the WPA that shows White making this work in the way he would often make murals. He would do these beautifully hand-drawn, rendered in watercolor studies, and then he would hold the studies, work with the studies while he was making the paintings. And this ability to understand a little bit of White's process as an artist, not necessarily as an activist, not necessarily as someone who was looking to make a specific point with his work, but really as a working artist who is committed to technique and to making the best possible artworks, was just an exceptional thing to think about. The show continued into the 1950s, which is one of my favorite moments of White's work. I think it's when he really comes into his own in terms of his graphic ability. He was an exceptional printmaker. His handling of linocut is really unparalleled. And you can see, as you look at more of White's work, certain tropes, certain motifs that were really appealing to him. And I love this image not only because it contains some of my favorite prints in the exhibition, but also because it showcases how incredible he was at his knowledge of anatomy was such that he could really use views of the human body in a way to communicate certain emotions. So this turning of the neck that you see in all of these figures, all of whom are identified as young workers, either industrial workers or farmers, was really to me such a beautiful statement about how one's body kind of can communicate that way. I will say unhesitatingly that one of the highlights of my career was the opportunity to engage with the late Harry Belafonte, who was both a friend and a patron of Charles White, and who I really believe brought the best out of that artist by commissioning him to make these works. These were works that were incredibly famous in the 50s and 60s when they were made. They were on television, they were published, and they had not been seen really outside of those very early black and white reproductions since that moment. So to be able to walk into Harry Belafonte's home and to see these extraordinary drawings, which are actually full of color and which really show you the best of drawing that Charles White was capable of making, was just exceptional. And so we were really thrilled to be able to include these works in the exhibition, and added an entire, I think, element of understanding to the work and to White's cultural position at that moment in the 50s and 60s that was really meaningful. I think White's audience, his ideal audience, was never, in fact, museum and gallery goers. It was rather people who could acquire the images of his work and engage with his work in their homes and in their day-to-day lives. And to that end, White made a lot of work that was published in books, that went on record covers, that was just kind of out in the world beyond gallery walls. And so one of the things I'm proudest of in our retrospective was that we were able to exhibit a lot of that more ephemeral material with the fine artwork to kind of show that engagement. So you can see here in this case, the book that much of the work you'll see in the exhibition here was made for. The book itself, he made record covers. He had a really interesting photography practice. There's an example of that in the exhibition as well. He was also just, I think, an incredible creator and someone who enjoyed experimentation. So he took advantage of the ceramic facilities that were available at the school he taught at. So we had some beautiful examples of his experiments with that in the exhibition. So an opportunity to really look at White beyond just his very dedicated vision to what an artist could be. The other kind of amazing thing about working in a museum and having a masterwork by an artist to engage with is that it allows you to dig very deep into process. So I did not understand early in my research how this work was made, and it was only through repeated looking over time, both with the naked eye, excuse me, and with our conservator under microscopes, that we began to understand how White, who was such a versed draftsman, was using very thinned down oil paint really as a dry media. So he was dipping rags and sticks and all kinds of other tools into this very thinned out pigment and rubbing it into the surface, really working it in a way that results in these incredibly modeled backgrounds. We also began to look at and understand what White's subject matter was from. We began to understand how often he was finding these very signature, powerful figures in other publications that were in his personal library. So here just an example of that. This is White's copy of a book by the photographer Leonard Freed called Black and White America. And you can see White's folded over corner of the book where the image that is at the center of Black Pope exists. And you can also see, of course, his smudgy fingerprints from when he was making this work and going back and forth and referencing the book. So that kind of very real research into the thinking and the process of an artist was incredibly validating, and I think shaped a lot of our understanding of what the retrospective could be. And I'll just close a little bit by talking about legacy. So White's retrospective was a major event for the museum, but it also extended in several ways. White was an incredibly influential art teacher, and he shaped hundreds of students' lives, and some of those students went on to become some of the best-known contemporary artists of our time. So we were fortunate to work with David Hammonds, who was a Charles White student and incredible supporter, on an exhibition that included our MoMA's first loan from the Royal Collection of the Queen of England, which was a Leonardo da Vinci drawing. So David Hammonds essentially paired White's work with this very beautiful Da Vinci in MoMA's permanent collection galleries. During the run of the retrospective, Carrie James Marshall, who was just off the high of having an incredibly successful retrospective in New York and elsewhere, agreed to do a panel discussion with us about his experience of Charles White and with several other leading scholars of the moment. So Carrie was able to bring that kind of history and knowledge to contemporary audiences at MoMA. And then finally, this is an image of a younger Nigerian-American artist named Toyin Ojiodotola, who is an exceptional draftsperson who also is dedicated to figuration around the Black figure. And Toyin, as a contemporary practitioner in this way, was able to bring really a unique viewpoint to Charles White's work and a new understanding. And we were fortunate to actually do a video piece with her looking at White's work in the show, and that lives on MoMA's website, should you be interested in seeing it. And of course, there's the legacy that Charles White has had on my life, which is not only the ability to continue to share and talk about this work with all of you, but also the kind of way it has shaped so much of the work I've done since then, both with on White's colleagues and contemporaries of that time, and with another generation of artists of color who continue to look to him as an example of the way to be both a good human and an exceptional artist. And so with that, I will turn it over to one of my favorite other good humans, Ian White. Thank you so much.
Hey, good evening, folks. I've been enjoying Cincinnati for the last couple of days here. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to do the far more personal note here, and we're just going to talk from 1965, and we're going to go back in time, actually, to 1865, and I'm just going to run you through this real quick. And it's more about some of my favorite works, too. Thank you, Esther, for giving that kind of overview. That really helps. And sometimes, you know, as the kind of son, you don't necessarily want to get locked into that overview thing, because I always feel like I missed something or I'm not including something that I should be. So anyway, this is just far more just some of my personal faves that happen to be in the show here, and some other ones that I thought have some relevance. So I'm starting off with this Frederick Douglass, 1965. That happens to be my birth year. And so we're going to play with 100 years real quick. And so oops, hold on. Sorry, folks. 1965, I get to come to the planet. You know, it's one of those things. But it's also one of these things, it's the first time where you see Frederick Douglass is a monumental figure for my father. You see him depicted in different iterations throughout the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, right, and the 60s. But this is when a fictive uncle of mine gave him in 1965 these Frederick Douglass papers. If you're familiar with Frederick Douglass, he was publishing these papers about enslavement, about slave trade, about many other things that were going on in the Black community. And so my father found these as great inspiration. And really, this is the first time that he's depicting this kind of motif in the background, where it begins the dynamic of these wanted poster series with the kind of breakdown. We talked, Esther was showing the Black Pope and the washes and so forth. This is done with gouache and paint. But it's really, when you start breaking down the figure, you see a kind of the head of Harriet Tubman there. And again, that's reflective of the Frederick Douglass papers. So it's just like one of these really pivotal pieces for me to see his own kind of development. And a lot of this is upon reflection, right? And then you like put things together. You're like, well, wait a minute, look at this. Okay, all right, I like this. I see how this works, right? And this also begins more of the wanted poster series. And there's a couple of representations here, as well as the works from Lerone Bennett, The Shaping of Black America, where he employs this CPO, kind of this wash, this oil wash. And I just find that really dynamic and engaging and very nuanced in terms of its interpretation and how it kind of works with the figure, the foreground, and so forth. And this happens to be from my fictive uncle, who gave him the paper. So these are very kind of seminal pieces, at least the ones I always grew up with since I was a child. I cannot not remember these things. And this is another one in poster number 10. I forget the number that's here in the collection. Number 5? Oh, thank you. This is number 10. And this is also one I wanted to pick out because the figure up top where it's tucked in, a lot of times my father utilized the images in different kind of media, and it actually became a lithograph, that figure. And it's that enslaved, tucked in, voyage kind of dynamic, and the future, so to speak. And again, language that is out of the paper, sold, bought, wanted. These things that are very poignant to the Afro-American kind of experience. But we all understand this kind of dynamic in terms of how people are marginalized in some capacity. And then hop back into the JQs. And again, we're revisiting. 65 was a hell of a year for my family, okay? It really was. But my father's output was amazing too. Now, I can, in hindsight, kind of say, oh, well, because entered the world and all this optimism. But that's very real because, my mother was a social worker, my father was an artist. These are things that you fought and really were concerned about the human spirit and how one engages with community and how that is expanded and nourished and those kind of things that really speak to our daily kind of coexistence with one another. And where do we find those balances, right? So this is just one of these works that I'm really fond of because it speaks of, my father had a tremendous kind of relationship to women because they were so strong in his family. He went to Chicago through the Great Migration. His mother was a domestic, but during the summers, they'd go back down to Mississippi. And Mississippi was a spot where his aunts played this role. They were in charge. Aunt Hasty, Aunt Bessie, and so forth. They were the ones that kept everything kind of going, right? So this strong woman figure in my father's work and portrayal is very significant to really speak about his own personal journey and these affluent women. And it's not necessarily portraits of them, but to speak of their kind of dynamic kind of presence. And plus, I want you to pay attention to the top there, the top head, because that's something that kind of comes when it first showed, the first picture that was up was, I Have a Dream, right? And that's 1976, I believe. 1965 is I Had a Dream, right? And they're kind of dynamics in terms of shifts and how these things come into play and how these different kind of figures are reutilized and again, this kind of imagery of you're painting one picture, but at the same time, this picture has many different significances, and it can kind of flow and have a life of its own in different singular works. And this JQ's, and this is just a fave because it basically looks like Belafonte. And I was fortunate enough to be able to have these indirect relationships with these guys because I was just a kid, right? I'm just the one guy hanging out. But at the same time, you get to go see concerts of these people performing, and you're like, wow, right? Some of it's very reflective as one, maturates and so forth. But it's just one of my the man gave me this whistle that I kept for many, many years that he used to do in his concerts. Did anyone ever go see a Belafonte concert? And he used to blow this whistle at the end of the concert, right? I was just so taken by that. But it was those kind of personal kind of things that kind of kept you engaged and like, wait a minute, that guy gave me a whistle. Oh, let me check it out. And as time goes, you start hearing his songs and really what is he singing about? What is he, really advocating for? This man was an extreme advocate in terms of what he was fighting for in terms of humanity issues and so forth. Again, going back to these dynamics of artist and social worker and how that plays and how you model your life after these kind of things, and you try to figure out where you're going to situate yourself. And again, 66, but this is another JAQs. And it just speaks to the shaping of Black America a little bit at the end here. Because of my experience, I got to travel with my father when I was young. And I mentioned this the other night about going to Johnson Publication and going on the floor that housed all my father's work, right? And kind of taking it for granted, because obviously I've been in his studios. He had two to three different studios that he worked in. And you would see work, you understand, Pops is there working, and he works hard, and a lot of time is spent. But when you go into this kind of professional building, you get to see all this work. And yeah, I think I'm like 11, 11, 12. And it was like ingratiating, but at the same time, it's like, oh yeah, that's my dad, that's what he does. But it was the guy who ended up driving my father around for that week we were there that really had, on a certain level, more residual, because he was just the driver. But once he found out who my father was, he picked us up every morning, right? It was really one of these things that later on in life, as a student in art school, and at one point drove across country and met with different people that he had studied with, whether they were like his students or his contemporaries, and they would just welcome you into their home. I remember going down to Southern, down in Houston, and hanging out with John Biggers for a moment. And John Biggers would say, well, I used to clean your daddy's brushes, right? That was just an amazing thing, but to see what he was doing and to see how he was impacting his community and his dedication to his craft and to what he was speaking of. And he was telling me, I learned a great deal of information from him within that week. But it went on. It went on to John T. Scott down in Xavier. It went on to numerous people who may not have been named or blue chip kind of artists, but they ran amazing art centers within their community, right? And they were tremendous contributors to the creative practice of life, right? And it ended up with being at Bob Blackburn's spot at the printmaking workshop in New York. And that was just one of those kind of amazing things where I was able to actually do some prints there. But it was one of those things that, the welcome wagon was beyond belief. And this is after some time my father had passed. And you begin to realize his kind of impact on a very kind of human level and what he meant to many others just beside myself. I'm his son just for a minute on a certain level. At the same time, I have maintained this man like nobody's business, spoke his name almost every day of my life, and the man has been dead since 1979. That's a long time, right? It really is. But it's one of those things that I embraced, and it's so fulfilling in the sense of speaking of things that are positive in your life, right? And how that works, and how that's kind of a go-to kind of thing, right? People have passages, that get you through the day. But I've got this visual kind of catalog that's amazing that it constantly feeds me. And this is another JQs. And this goes back to the ending 1865. So I went from 1965 to 1865, just in the sense of, this is the end of the Confederate Army is 1865, right? So 100 years that passed through into 1965 to where I come here on the planet and try to carve out my own little niche and try to figure out how I'm going to navigate things is really kind of a dynamic kind of challenge, to say the least. We're in this dynamic era. I've got a 13-year-old, like he's the hope for the future. And it's really, if you're able to get, I don't give plugs much, but Esther asked me to do this book about my father for MoMA, for the retrospective. And it was me taking my son to see his grandfather's last mural. And it was just really cool. It was just, because it was one of those moments where, if you have children or have that experience, that awakening, and I think my kid was only, God, I don't know, 7 or 8 at that time, and he was just in that wow factor, right? And wow factor is an amazing place to be, right? Because everything is just so outrageously large, right? And he doesn't even understand it. It'll be one of those things that, upon reflection, again, just as much as it is for me, you're in that, wow, okay, that's kind of a model, and we all need these kind of models in terms of helping our direction and helping the way in which we navigate this, because it ain't easy, And on a certain level, maybe it's not meant to be easy. But with wrapping that up, I have had a great time in Cincinnati. I really have. I'm a big fan of Duncanson because my father introduced very early on to Duncanson, to Tanner, to these great African-American artists. And I was able to go over to the Taft Museum today. And that was just another one of those glorious experiences. And I got to go to the Underground Railroad Museum, which I didn't know existed, right? It was just because I wanted to go see Riverfront Stadium, because I was a big Red Machine fan, right? From, playing Little League. I was Johnny Bench, man. I was catcher. I was like, that was it, right? So all these kind of things that are surprises when you end up in a place that you're not that familiar with have been very nice. So I thank you, and we will continue.
Thank you. We're going to have Esther and Ian join me up here, and I'm going to start the conversation off with a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to everybody else. Actually, did you have a mic for me? I'm going to sit down. Thank you very much. Okay, I have a whole page of questions, which I'm not going to get to, but we're going to ask a few questions and let these two chat for a few minutes, and then I want to give an opportunity for all of you to ask questions. And I think maybe we'll start with Esther and look a little bit back at the exhibition at MoMA. And how did you get started on this project, and was there any convincing to do about whether or not you were going to have a Charles White exhibition?
Yeah, that's a good story, I suppose. The Museum of Modern Art has been, we've changed a lot in the past 20 years, but previous to that, we told what was kind of a very specific story about the development of modern and contemporary art. And by the time you hit 1945, that story mostly revolves around people like Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, artists making big abstract paintings. So it was unusual for us to do an entire retrospective dedicated to an artist who was doing the opposite of that, who was dedicated to making works on paper, to making figurative works on paper, and to really making work that engaged with really a history of kind of humanism and thought about the figure as both as something that could be used as a shared value to communicate with audiences, but also something that kind of transcended all of that in a way. And so he was an unusual figure for us to consider in that way. I think the convincing started and ended with the acquisition of the Black Pope. It's just that amazing a work. And I think once we started digging into that work, which we had kind of unprecedented access to because we bought it, everything went kind of more smoothly from there.
That's wonderful. And what was the response to the exhibition?
It was exceptional. People still, we have an amazing security staff at MoMA, and I have still members of that staff who are like, oh, you're the curator who did that incredible Charles White show. When can we do another show like that one? Yeah. So it really had, I think, an outsized impact on our museum community, as well as kind of the audiences at large.
It's wonderful. On the more personal side of things, Ian, what was it like to live with Charles White?
I dug it. I got to travel. I got to take off from school. I got to do all these things, but a lot of it was really, okay, you sit over there and I'm going to handle business. And you just kind of listen. So I've learned to become, since day one, a very good listener. And that has served me well. It really has. I'm in the process of, again, teaching my son this. And these are challenges.
Yeah.
But it was great. I got to see a lot of different things, meet a lot of artists. And then you end up, again, revisiting these people as as your own personal journey in life continues. And you're like, man, he's a solid guy. I saw Bing Davis the other day. Is he here? And that I remember him, right? I remember, I still have the artwork that he gave my father. I know what that piece is. And that's just kind of, that's, the local kind of dynamic. But there are many other things that speak to that. Fortunately, my father, as he taught in Los Angeles at Otis, these former students he would always have to the house. And so I was able to maintain these relationships. And it was also after my father died, it was one of these things that, okay, who's around now? Kind of, because since, the light's off, but then the light's not really off. And people who really cared about the man and cared about his family were very present, and even more so on a certain level, because of his contribution. But it was like, my father the barber used to come into the house because he appreciated his work. The dentist, he would just go, and he never charged my father. There's certain kind of things that, I spoke of the man who drove my father around, but it was his contribution because it was his representation of African-American experience in the 30s and the 40s and in the 50s that were on these little pamphlets of treat people of color with respect, dignified portrayal, horrific acts sometimes that took place to World War II vets, because my father was in World War II. And he went in as an artist. Somebody's got to paint the camouflage, right? So he was painting tanks, and doing that kind of thing. Still with the understanding of contributing to fighting fascism, right? But unfortunately, he also contracted tuberculosis because the black troops in the South, they had terrible flooding, and they basically put all the black troops, fighting the floods in Mississippi. That hurt him for his longevity, but it did not hurt his contribution, which continued.
Well, and Julie, if I could just jump in. When we started working on the retrospective around 2012, it's not like there was a ton of published material that we could reference in terms of getting all of the background information you need. We had Ian, and Ian had maintained exceptional relationships with people who knew and worked with Charles White. So it was really through Ian's advocacy and his continuation of really this sense of warmth and true relationships with so many students, both well-known and people who were part of Charles White's life, that allowed us to really get at that kind of critical information that you need to do that kind of show. So it was very much a privilege to be able to publish something that then became a reference book for so many other institutions and scholars. But all of that really started with Ian's dedication to, I think, waiting for the rest of us to catch up with what he had known for a very long time.
Thank you.
Yes.
Right, and I continue to work with preserving different folks' archives, especially a lot of artists who basically sometimes they don't have children, and sometimes the children aren't interested, and sometimes it's a burden, and sometimes individuality reigns true, and that can be a lot of challenges. But I must admit, MoMA has done well by Charles White. And Cincinnati's doing well by him right now. That isn't always the case. And a lot of institutions have their challenges with kind of a diverse understanding of art and creative representation. That's just real. But we can see that not only in the expectations of art institutions, but throughout, if we talk professional as well. Throughout any profession, this is the case, right? The Black Pope is a seminal work. I sold that to them. I had a choice where that went. And it was important to find the right home. And this is real. It makes a difference when you feel some, not necessarily love, but you feel an understanding of care and nurturing, and that we will be the caretakers. We will continue to expand. Esther fortunately helped with this Da Vinci Black Pope. Esther wrote a book on the Black Pope. I mean, right? There's some very positive things, but it's just not Esther. It's institutions that have really kind of opened up the door in terms of understanding the relevance of contributions of others to get us to this next spot. And we may not be able to define that next spot, but we know there has to be something else, something that's more inclusive, something that speaks to our individuality as individuals. And it helps us embrace that collective. And so, you do a lot of talking about, go team. I have a lot of young folks around me because I taught for many years. And we have a thing we have Team White. And Team White is a really fun thing. And I want to keep it that way. But we really try to help out as many creative people as we can and continue with the understanding of contribution. That's very rewarding and fulfilling. I mean, I can't imagine doing anything else.
I think we're going to open up the questions to the audience. We can talk a little more? Okay. I'm just asking Haley, kept trying to keep track of the time so that we're finished before we close the museum. Or maybe. We love to close the place. So one of my questions is about the shaping of Black America, because that is a kind of a core, a very special feature of this exhibition, and I realize that some of you may not have seen it or had time to spend in it yet. But there's a group of 12 illustrations for a book that was published by the Johnson Publishing Company and was written by Lerone Bennett Jr., who was the longtime editor of Ebony magazine, which Johnson published. And I'm interested in White's relationship with Ebony, first of all, which I think led to this commission, and anything you might be able to add about the importance of these paintings. Who would like to go?
Yeah, what I can say is that White at that moment in the 50s and 60s was exceptionally well known. That can be now he's also pretty well known, but thinking back at that time, there were not that many established, celebrated, accessible African-American artists, just like that people knew of. Pardon me. That is 100% correct. Thank you. That is very true. And just at that point, there was also potentially not as many successful African-American publishers or insurance brokers. So there were definitely these key institutions, and I think there was a network between the people who established those institutions. So I imagine that Lerone Bennett Jr. is this major publisher of these incredibly popular magazines, Ebony, Jet, and a lot of other, Negro Digest, like a lot of other really major publications aimed at Black communities, knew White through that kind of connection and would have been someone that he was particularly interested in highlighting and engaging in work that way.
The Shaping of Black America is a seminal book. It really is. And it's one of those things, again, when we think about the informational highway of Google, right? This was a document that's expanded and really kind of gave you an understanding of what was taking place, like from enslavement to present day, and kind of gave you a survey of how these certain, you see it in the works that are here, in terms of like employment, just the roles that African Americans had. They weren't just like, these people were merchants. They were real folks. They had jobs. They read the newspaper. All these other kind of things in terms of kind of fictive understandings of the Black experience. Really, Lerone Bennett Jr.'s book is, and he was a really nice guy, but it's very significant in that capacity. I remember him as a kid, right? And this is one of those things where you're like, wow, this is a proper man, and he's telling you this. You take it very serious. These are very important things. Richmond Barthé was like that for me. And Richmond Barthé was, like, if you ever see anything on the Harlem Renaissance. He's the brother who's doing the sculptor, right? Right. He is like the man, but he basically left, as a lot of Afro-Americans did, and basically came back in the 70s as an expat, right, from Europe. There's a wonderful illustrator. If you know Ollie Harrington, does that name ring to you? He was a very amazing man who was in Germany, right? And Germany had a tremendous amount of African-American artists at one point. Recently, I went back there a few years back and looked at their archive, and it's dense in terms of the representation. But that just speaks to, again, a larger, broader breadth that existed that may have not been acknowledged. And we're at this point now where I'm in California, and I'm working a lot with placement of archives. And the Getty has an initiative of collecting African-American art archives. And it's really one of these amazing things, because once the institution gets it and digitizes it and makes it available, then it kind of speaks of this kind of continued growth, where you have new expansion on these ideas and recognition of the people that existed, because otherwise you really were basically left to, you know, Life magazine. I mean, you had Gordon Parks, but that was it, right? And you had these other kind of publications, but that was it, right? So yes, they existed, and there is documentation of that, and a lot of times that exists in a box that needs to be digitized, that needs to be preserved, right? And those things are really strong attributes that at one point are, you know, Esther mentioned how we save things, and we did, because my mother was like that too. And and what she did was what was amazing, and I wouldn't suggest you do this, is that she wrote on the back of photographs.
Oh, no, I love that.
I know, I do
Definitely
too,
do
you
that.
don't want to do that.
Because otherwise, 50 years later, it's like, who is in this photo?
But exactly, it gave life to who these people are. And, you know, otherwise, it would be very hard. I mean, basically, you damn near have to dig them up. Because otherwise, how can we go around and identify these contributors? And so that was really significant. And the level of expansion off those documents is amazing, right? Especially when you have all these people in these liberal arts colleges that are doing new theories, new studies on creative existence and life, and giving different responses. Torrin's response in terms of her, you know, take on my father's work. She has a wonderful line. She says, look it, you can see Charles White just flexing, right? Because of his ability as a draftsman. And it's really unprecedented. I must admit, I'm biased 100%. But at the same time, I know what it takes to do a good drawing. I know what it takes in terms of the understanding of composition. And that is the challenge of all creativity, right? Is figuring out how you're going to compose it and deliver your message. I don't care what it is, literary, visual, sound, it's composition, right? And those things are really these you know, core points of departure. And by saving and trying to help these folks, I tell you, I live good. And at the end of the day, I sleep well. I may have some aches and pains, but I sleep well because of what we're trying to do and things that are changing institutionally. I sleep better now than I did a decade ago, right? And even amongst some of the chaos and the madness that's going on, and there's plenty of that to go around, that there are these really, really amazing kind of optimistic moments. And a lot of times they come from creativity. One of my father's main things was that the artists are going to save the planet. And he said that early on, right? Because it takes creative thought to get around this madness.
Yes.
Right, it really does.
Yes.
And we should all be, a certain level, advocates of that.
So on that note, we're going to open up the audience, for a few questions from the audience. We've
If
got
you
one.
could please
We've got
wait
Damon
for the
over.
microphone as well.
Yes.
I'll bring it to you.
We got Damon.
Good evening, everybody. Mr. White, I just want to thank you for being here and being a good caretaker of your father's things. I'm a little overwhelmed right now because I got to do a writing on the black worker that's in the museum right now. And I'm a self-proclaimed poet. You know, I had no teaching or anything like that. But the stories and everything that you're telling, just like the man that drove your father around, you know, I'm the FST supervisor here at the Cincinnati Art Museum, so I'm responsible for keeping the museum clean. And now, you know, just being here, my job, it got more important to me, more so now. And
Thank you.
yes, sir. I didn't get a chance to talk to you last night, so I said, I'm going to be able to say something to you tonight. But it's overwhelming to me still, and it's like I'm a 60s baby myself, and, you know, that was a time, you know, drugs was rampant in the homes and stuff like, you know, so growing up like that, you didn't have, you know, certain things you just didn't acquire or get cultivated and everything. My mother told me when I was 5 years old that, you know, I always was singing and making a song out of everything. You know, that's where my poetry comes from. It starts as a song, then it gets to be spoken word, then it's written down. But again, I wanted to get back. I really don't have a question. I just have a comment, and I thank for the growth that is coming to this Cincinnati Art Museum. I've been here for almost 5 years, and I've just seen it just grow and elevate and just get so much better, you know. And I'm in between your father and W.E.B. Du Bois, and I was telling my wife's from Nigeria, and I said, babe, I'm in between Charles White and W.E.B. Du Bois. She's like, who is that? You know? So we try to share each other's culture. You know, she teaches me about Nigeria history, and I said, you're going to find out, you know. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to thank you again for being a good caretaker, because some things get passed down to the generations, but if someone's not taking care of it right, it's gone. You know, like 100%. Homes and everything else. So I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Hi, so I'm from the south side of Chicago. It's fascinating to me that you didn't know who he was till 2011, because if you're from the south side of Chicago, I'm a 1966 baby.
Well, hold on. 2011, wait a minute.
No, me.
Oh.
Me. I didn't really get out of New York much, sorry.
But that's
Yeah.
not, you know, that's not, don't fault Esther, because
can
that's
call
the
me.
case in so many different institutions.
I-
It's
I-
amazing. It
And
really is.
and the key word you said was institutions, because certain institutions did know who him. DuSable Museum knew him. Southside Community Arts Center knew him. Lots of places on the south side of Chicago knew Charles White, and thought he was important. Ebony magazine, you know, we grew up with Charles White. I couldn't imagine not knowing Charles White. And I remember the retrospective when it came. I was like, I was amazed that it had taken that long, but it was like you said, my friend Heather actually was the executive director over there, and I remember her telling me about finding different pieces of art stored in the basement and stored in the attic, and you know, Elizabeth Catlets and Margaret Burroughs, and you know, things that, you know, we could literally touch that we shouldn't have been touching. Right. So my question to you is, if you, as an art historian, didn't hear about him till 2011, what is the art community and art institutions doing to change that dynamic? Because
that's an excellent question.
we've been, like I said, it's a little bit Christopher Columbus-y, like you're discovering stuff that we already knew about.
I think that's absolutely right. So I think the challenge And I can only speak for myself, and the thing about institutions, which is tricky, is that they're, of course, made up of individuals, but also, like, I'm not the institute, you know, like, I'm me, and there's only so much one person can do within. But for me, the issue has to do with money and resources and how institutions that, for whatever reason, have that, choose to use that. So I was exceptionally fortunate to be at an institution that has resources and trusted me to use those resources to make a beautifully illustrated book of all of this work that, as you're saying, so many people knew about and had, but perhaps didn't have that, the ability to photograph in a certain way or display or to ship all over the US in a crate that kept it from falling apart. So yeah, but what we don't want to do, I think, as institutions is just take. And that is the tricky thing. Like, how do we both do an exhibition of Charles White's work that celebrates it and exposes it, or, allows so many people to see it and appreciate it without either denying or leaving behind the institutions that have been caring for that work since 1929. I mean, the Southside Community Arts Center is a legend and was where White did his first important work. So how do you essentially honor that legacy and that institution while also pushing things forward? And I'll say, like, one of the small ways we were able to do that was when we brought Charles White's first mural to the Museum of Modern Art. That was hanging in the Howard University Law School Library, very beautifully, but in, if I may say, a not very nice frame, or a frame not befitting its major status as the important work of art that it is. And MoMA took our framer. I took the image out of the slide, but I have a picture of our framer there. We took it off the wall. He was like, yeah, this is no good. And they brought it to MoMA for the show. They built a gorgeous, brand new, amazing frame for it. We put anti-reflective plexi on it. It's gorgeous. We showed the painting in a space, and then it went back to Howard with that gorgeous new frame on it. And that was, that was what we needed to do to show that work, but in a very small way. That's something that allows the work to go back and to be meaningful and protected in a way for future generations of Howard University students and Howard University law students who look at the work. So that's like a very small example. But for me, when you're working with artists who have such outsized roles in communities, but communities that maybe can't get easily to the institutions that have these resources, that's the critical part of the work. Like, if I can, through this work, not only do a major show, but also help care for and like continue on the work that these institutions have been doing. Like, that's, as Ian was saying, like, that's the work. That's what you want to be doing.
They still have the same paneling on the Southside Community Arts Center from when my father was there, right? It's amazing. And you can see a Marion Perkins just sitting right there about to fall over. I mean, there's some things. They're constantly dealing with, can we make next month? Are we going to be open? Are we going to still continue to service the community? The DuSable's like that too. Right? And so, I mean, in talking with this understanding and the Art Institute in Chicago, I was like, they said, we try to help with programming and stuff. I was like, stop doing that. On a certain level, send your development team, right? They don't necessarily need new drywall, but they need to understand, or another program. You need to send in folks that know how to generate funding. Because it's like the same dynamic of sending rice to folks that are hungry. Send the agriculturalist, send the botanist, send the folks that really can make a significant contribution, right? But that's beginning to happen, right? But it takes a long time. I went through art school, right? I went to the San Francisco Art Institute, and I also went to Otis, my father's former college. I say that to say that I was usually the only person of color, right? And you ended up, by default, being the teacher. You introduced all these other individuals, right? The instructors weren't doing it. And that didn't suggest, just because, again, there wasn't representation of that. But I had these very obscure books So I was able to take photos and make a slide library and give that to the college that I was at. I mean, it didn't hurt that Angela Davis was there too, right? It really didn't. But it's also kind of having that kind of, wherewithal. And folks, grassroots is real, right? And realizing that there's a need and realizing that collectively, we can do something. And but it's like, what do you do? And you have to ask, I don't need new programming. I need the development team, right? I need a level of sustainability, independence, independent of your institution as well. There's a lot of money in Chicago. I'm not so sure they should have the same paneling from 1930. And it's not an aesthetic decision, right? It really isn't. And that you find across the great states, right? All these amazing little art centers that have nourished and fostered and continued to develop youth and young people and given an outlet for poets, for visual artists, for theater folks, for musicians. And we have to find a way to help support those institutions so they're not worried about the next month all the time. But that's a collective kind of thing. I mean, that's really something that you adapt as a community, and a very independent thing too. And on a certain level, it should be independent. You don't necessarily want Exxon taking care of everybody, right? Because obviously they have their own agenda.
So we've got one more. I think we have a question over here, and I think we're going to have to start to wrap things up.
I just wanted to end the whole thing in saying, I've been around doing art and visiting art for a long time. I think times are changing, and I think our Black art community is being spoken about. And I know for sure that it's going to be better in the future. We know we had a rough past, but that's not where we're going to stay. I can tell that by seeing the interest that you guys have up on stage. So I personally want to just say thank you, and I appreciate it, and I see the future.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful evening.